Mel Brooks has spent more than 6 decades redefining comedy, building worlds where chaos was always under control. At nearly a century old, he has nothing left to prove, and that makes his honesty sting sharper than ever. In private conversations and rare interviews, he admitted there were actors he could never forgive, not because they lacked talent, but because they broke the fragile rhythm that kept his films alive. For Brooks, trust and timing were sacred, and once broken, they could never be repaired. Tonight we dive into the 5 names he quietly carried on his blacklist, and why each of them left a scar that never healed. Frank Langella, a stage titan who collapsed the rhythm. When Mel Brooks began developing Dracula, Dead and Loving. In the early 1990s, the studio executives were certain they had found their answer in Frank Langella. He wasn't just a familiar face. He had already embodied the role of Dracula on Broadway in 1977, where his performance drew rave reviews, and later reprised it in John Badham's 1979 film. His tall frame, commanding voice, and aura of dark magnetism made him the kind of Dracula audiences expected. On paper, it was a safe, even brilliant choice. To the industry, Langella was the definitive Dracula. But to Mel Brooks, that became the problem. Brooks never set out to create a faithful Gothic retelling. He wasn't interested in candlelit corridors and ominous silences. His version of Dracula was meant to be chaos wrapped in control. Slapstick, pratfalls, zingers delivered so quickly the audience barely had time to breathe before the next laugh. In his world, comedy worked only when actors dove headfirst into absurdity without fear of looking foolish. Langella, however, brought with him the solemn weight of Shakespeare. From the very first rehearsals, his delivery felt etched in stone. Pauses stretched into eternity, jokes collapsed under heavy tones, and scenes meant to bounce instead dragged into melodrama. The cast and crew sensed it immediately. While seasoned comedians thrived on quick rhythm and improvisation, Langella's seriousness slowed everything down. Brooks tried to nudge him off balance, suggesting lighter readings, offering small rewrites, even pitching physical gags. But Langella resisted, treating the text as scripture rather than playground. The tension reached its peak during a table read when Brooks handed him a new comedic line. Langella blinked and asked flatly, "Do you want me to mock the text?" The silence was sharp. Brooks, already frustrated, shot back, "No, I want you to survive it." That exchange sealed Langella's fate. Within days, the decision was made. There was no fight, no dramatic firing, just a quiet replacement. Leslie Nielsen stepped into the role, bringing exactly what Brooks craved. Sincerity so straight-faced it became absurd. Nielsen leaned into the ridiculous without hesitation, letting the world collapse around him while never breaking character. That commitment to chaos is what made the final film, released in 1995, hold together, even if it never reached the box office heights Brooks had once enjoyed. The official explanation for Langella's exit was the familiar creative differences, but those close to the production knew the truth. Brooks wasn't willing to arm wrestle a marble statue into slapstick. For him, talent alone wasn't enough. Comedy required rhythm, humility, and above all, trust. Langella wanted to preserve Dracula's crown, but Brooks was making a circus where every king had to fall. In that world, refusing to stumble was the greatest mistake of all. Gene Wilder, the pain of losing a creative twin. For Mel Brooks, no actor ever meant more than Gene Wilder. Their paths first crossed in the late 1960s, when Brooks was still fighting for recognition as a filmmaker, and Wilder was beginning to prove himself as a rare comic actor who could balance innocence with madness. Their first collaboration, The Producers, changed both of their lives. Wilder's portrayal of the neurotic accountant Leo Bloom turned Brooks's outrageous script into something warm and human, grounding the chaos with vulnerability. Audiences connected instantly, and the film's success forged a partnership that seemed destined to last. Through the 1970s, their bond only grew stronger. Wilder starred in Blazing Saddles, Brooks's scathing Western parody, and the two immediately followed it with Young Frankenstein later that same year. Wilder didn't just act in that film, he co-wrote much of the script, bringing Brooks's unpolished ideas into focus with a sensitivity few others could manage. Brooks often said Wilder was the only actor he trusted to hear his half-finished thoughts. He could scribble a line on a napkin, hand it to Wilder, and Wilder would play it as if he had been rehearsing it for months. Their creative rhythm was seamless, instinctive, and built on trust. For Brooks, it felt like finding a twin. But even the strongest partnerships can break. After Young Frankenstein became a classic, Wilder revealed he had written another script, The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes's Smarter Brother, and he wanted to direct it himself. He turned to Brooks, expecting him to produce, just as he had always supported Brooks's vision. Brooks refused. He told Wilder he wasn't ready, that directing demanded more than charm and wit, and that it could end badly. Wilder took those words not as advice, but as betrayal. For years he had helped Brooks turn madness into gold, and now when it was his turn, Brooks closed the door. Wilder pressed forward, directing the film in 1975. He cast familiar faces from Brooks's world, Marty Feldman, Madeline Kahn, but the spark wasn't there. The film earned polite reviews, but failed to carry the same magic that defined their earlier work. For Brooks, it was painful to watch. He confided later that it felt like a brother packing up and leaving home, taking with him the best jokes they once shared. The fallout was quiet, but devastating. There was no public feud, no bitter interviews, only silence. For years, they didn't speak. When they finally reunited by chance at a small event in the 1980s, they shook hands, exchanged jokes, and smiled for cameras. But something was gone. They never worked together again. Brooks continued to praise Wilder's genius in public, calling him one of the greatest talents he had ever known. But behind closed doors, he admitted the trust never returned. For a man who built his entire career on timing, that fracture was permanent. Losing Wilder wasn't just losing a friend, it was losing the only creative partner who spoke his private language, the one person who could finish his thoughts before he had even spoken them. Chevy Chase, the ego that broke the rhythm. By the mid-1980s, Chevy Chase was one of the biggest comedy stars in America. With Saturday Night Live, Caddyshack, and National Lampoon's Vacation, his deadpan delivery and sarcastic wit had made him bankable at the box office. Studios often suggested his name to Mel Brooks whenever a new project was in development, especially when Brooks began shaping Spaceballs in the mid-1980s. On paper, it made sense. Chase had star power, timing, and an instantly recognizable style. But to Brooks, that style represented everything he didn't want. Brooks ran his sets like ensembles. He believed comedy worked best when actors passed the rhythm back and forth, each line building on the next like a relay race. Chase didn't work that way. He waited for his opening, for the perfect moment to deliver the sharpest line and take the spotlight. He was clever, but it was a solitary kind of cleverness. Brooks once told a casting director, "He's not acting. He's waiting for everyone else to stop talking so he can prove he's the smartest in the room." That approach clashed with Brooks's philosophy. Comedy wasn't about winning. It was about rhythm, trust, and generosity. The tension came to a head when Chase's name was floated for the role of Dark Helmet in Spaceballs. Chase had the look, the sarcasm, and the draw, but Brooks chose Rick Moranis instead. His reason was simple. Moranis knew when to step back. He could let someone else take the laugh and then slide back into rhythm without disrupting the machine. Chase, Brooks believed, would have hijacked the timing. To him, that was fatal. A single ego-pulling focus could make the entire comedy collapse. Brooks was never cruel in public. He never insulted Chase by name, But in interviews, he hinted at actors who were so self-aware they forget to be present. Insiders knew exactly who he meant. Chase's reputation for arrogance had already spread through Hollywood, with stories of clashes on sets and strained relationships. For Brooks, that reputation was enough. He admired Chase's talent but refused to risk the ensemble for it. In the end, Chevy Chase never appeared in a Mel Brooks film. Not because he wasn't funny, but because Brooks believed his comedy came at the expense of everyone else's. For a director obsessed with rhythm, that was unforgivable. Harvey Korman, the partner who pushed too far. Among the many actors Mel Brooks worked with, Harvey Korman stood out as one of the most dependable. Known for his years on The Carol Burnett Show, Korman had impeccable timing and the rare ability to stretch a joke without snapping it. In Blazing Saddles, his role as the corrupt politician Hedley Lamar became one of the film's comic highlights, blending menace with absurdity. Brooks valued Korman so much that he cast him again in High Anxiety and History of the World, Part 1. On screen, their collaboration looked effortless, but behind the camera, tensions were quietly mounting. By the time they filmed High Anxiety, Korman had grown used to a certain freedom in his performances. Coming from sketch comedy, he thrived on improvisation, adding flourishes and testing new directions. Brooks, however, ran his sets with the precision of a conductor. Every beat, every pause, and every reaction was carefully placed to protect the rhythm of the comedy. When Korman began asking for rewrites and larger expansions of his role, Brooks resisted. He told Korman, "We already wrote the funny part. We just need you to do it." The disagreement didn't explode into shouting matches, but it simmered. Crew members described the atmosphere as passive warfare. Brooks and Korman avoided direct conversations, passing notes through assistants instead of addressing each other face to face. What had once been playful collaboration turned into negotiation, with each line of dialogue feeling like a tug of war. The stress drained Brooks, who believed comedy had to feel like freedom, not a battlefield. When High Anxiety wrapped, Brooks had made up his mind. Korman's brilliance was undeniable, but it came with resistance that slowed down the machine. And for Brooks, rhythm mattered more than loyalty. He quietly moved on without him in later projects, never casting him again. Korman continued to speak fondly of Brooks in interviews, acknowledging the opportunity he had been given. Brooks, for his part, always praised Korman's performances on screen, but privately, he admitted that the cost of working together had become too heavy. The rhythm had broken, and once broken, Brooks never tried to repair it. For him, the laughter had to come without struggle. Jerry Lewis, the genius who couldn't share the stage. By the mid-1980s, Mel Brooks and Jerry Lewis were two names often spoken in the same breath. Both had built their reputations as comedic architects, writing, directing, and starring in material that shaped generations of laughter. A collaboration between them seemed inevitable, even logical. Studios pushed for it, believing the combined star power would guarantee success. But Brooks resisted, and the reasons cut to the heart of how he believed comedy should work. Jerry Lewis had spent decades as a larger-than-life figure. From The Nutty Professor to his partnership with Dean Martin, his career was defined by control. He often rewrote scenes, directed himself, and demanded that everything orbit his vision. For many, that intensity produced brilliance. For Brooks, it was poison. His films thrived on ensemble balance, where no single actor dominated the screen and every performer trusted the rhythm. Lewis, he believed, could never surrender enough to make that possible. The confirmation came during a private dinner in the mid-1980s. A mutual contact arranged the meeting, hoping the two legends might find common ground. Brooks arrived curious, maybe even hopeful, but from the moment Lewis entered the room, it was clear the conversation would be one-sided. He launched into a long monologue about the failures of American comedy, the mistakes of younger comedians, and his own vision for the future. Brooks barely spoke. He later told friends that Lewis wasn't interested in collaboration, he wanted an audience. That dinner was enough. When Lewis's name was later floated for a role in Brooks's developing satire Life Stinks, he rejected the idea immediately. "I don't need someone who thinks he's funnier than the film," he reportedly told his producer. Brooks kept his comments polite in public, never insulting Lewis directly. But privately, he described working with him as a nuclear event waiting to happen. The clash of egos, the battles for control, the constant risk of derailment, it wasn't worth the gamble. For Brooks, comedy was chaos carefully orchestrated, a symphony of timing and trust. With Jerry Lewis, it would have become a solo act. That was something Brooks would never allow. He admired the genius, but he kept it at a distance. Because in his world, even brilliance wasn't enough if it couldn't share the stage. Looking back at these 5 names, Frank Langella, Gene Wilder, Chevy Chase, Harvey Korman, and Jerry Lewis, it's clear that Mel Brooks never blacklisted out of malice. He did it to protect the fragile balance that made his comedies timeless. For him, rhythm, humility, and trust were sacred. Once broken, they couldn't be restored. At 99, he speaks about these choices not with anger, but with clarity. They were necessary sacrifices that kept his films alive for generations. Which of these stories surprised you the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold Hollywood stories.